The accusation landed in the room like it had been rehearsed for weeks. She manipulated him, my older brother said, his voice steady, controlled, almost compassionate. And now she wants to act like she doesn't understand why we're here? We were seated in a private meeting room at First Harbor Trust, the kind of place meant to make difficult conversations feel official. Glass walls, neutral carpet, a long polished table that reflected everyone's faces a little too clearly. My name is Claire Donnelly, and that afternoon, my own family was explaining to a financial officer why I shouldn't be trusted. I didn't interrupt. I sat with my hands folded around a paper cup of lukewarm water, my back straight, my eyes lowered. Across from me sat Evan Donnelly, my brother, and beside him his wife Sharon, nodding at carefully chosen moments. The trust officer, Michael Reed, listened without expression, pen resting loosely between his fingers. According to Evan, I had become overly involved in our father's affairs during the last year of his life. According to Sharon, I had blurred boundaries. According to both of them, I was emotionally compromised and therefore unfit to manage anything our father had left behind. They spoke calmly, kindly, as if this were about my well-being. I said nothing. Michael finally turned to me. "Ms. Donnelly, would you like to respond to these concerns?" I shook my head once. "No," I said quietly. "Not right now." There was a pause, the kind that makes people shift in their chairs. Evan glanced at me, confused. He had expected denial, tears maybe, an explanation he could correct. Silence wasn't part of his plan. The meeting continued without my input. Dates were mentioned, documents referenced. Phrases like undue influence and protective oversight floated through the room, heavy but vague. I let them. Because if you're reading this and wondering why I didn't speak, why I didn't defend myself when it mattered most, I want you to know something. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes it's a decision. If you're following this story and feel that familiar tightening in your chest, the one that comes when someone talks about you instead of to you, stay with me. If you feel like it, leave a note or thought below. I read every one, and they matter more than you might think. Now, let me tell you why I was sitting in that room at all. To understand why my family underestimated me so easily, you need to know what my life looks like from the outside. I'm 41 years old. I live alone in a small ranch-style house outside Wilmington, Delaware. I drive a sensible car. I shop with a list. I don't post much on social media, and when I do, it's usually a picture of something practical: freshly painted shelves, a tidy garden bed, a new lamp I found on clearance. I work as a quality compliance associate for a mid-sized pharmaceutical packaging company. It's not a job people ask follow-up questions about. I make sure procedures are followed, that records are complete, that nothing slips through unnoticed. It's quiet work. My family hears that and translates it as unimportant. Evan is a real estate developer. Sharon runs a lifestyle consulting business. They speak confidently. They network. They know how to sound impressive in a room full of strangers. I don't. My father, Thomas Donnelly, was the opposite of Evan. He was methodical, reserved, deeply uncomfortable with confrontation. After my mother passed away 15 years ago, he became even quieter. I was the one who called every Sunday, the one who noticed when his mail piled up unopened, the one who drove him to appointments when Evan was too busy, and Sharon sent fruit baskets instead. None of that looked significant to anyone else. When my father's health declined, I took time off work to help organize his medications, his bills, his files. I created systems, because that's what I do when things start to feel unstable. Evan saw control. Sharon saw interference. They never asked what my father wanted. They assumed. And because I didn't argue, because I didn't announce myself as anything more than a helpful daughter, they decided I was exactly that. Helpful, temporary, replaceable. At family gatherings, I was the one clearing plates while conversations drifted over my head. When decisions were made, I heard about them afterward. So when Evan spoke in that trust office with confidence about my supposed instability, it didn't surprise me. People don't question the quiet one. They assign meaning to the silence and move on. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't see yet, was that my entire professional life had been built around one simple habit: noticing what doesn't match, not reacting immediately, and waiting until the facts are done speaking. People often assume betrayal comes with cruelty. In my experience, it usually arrives dressed as practicality. The first time my brother Evan chose something else over me, it didn't feel like rejection. It felt like logistics. I was 24, fresh out of college, working my first real job, and still learning how to sound confident on the phone. Our mother had been gone less than a year when Evan announced he was moving out of state for a development opportunity. He framed it as temporary, strategic, necessary. "You'll understand one day," he said, clapping my shoulder like I was younger than I was. "This is how things work." At the time, our father didn't argue. He never did when Evan spoke with certainty. He nodded and asked practical questions about housing, timing, flights home for holidays. I stood in the kitchen doorway holding a dish towel, watching my family reorganize itself around Evan's absence. No one asked what it would mean for me. That pattern repeated itself over the years. When Evan missed birthdays, it was because he was building something. When he skipped holidays, it was because work demanded it. When decisions were made without me, it was because you don't like conflict anyway. That last one stuck. It became the explanation for everything. When our father started forgetting small things, appointments, passwords, names, it was assumed I would handle it. Quietly, without discussion. When Evan called once a month, it was considered involvement. When I showed up 3 times a week, it was considered expected. Then, gradually, that expectation turned into suspicion. "You're awfully close to Dad's finances," Sharon remarked once, smiling like she was joking. I wouldn't even know where to start. I laughed it off. That's what I'd been trained to do. But the truth was, Evan hadn't lost touch with our father. He had outsourced responsibility to me. And when responsibility began to resemble authority, he wanted it back, without acknowledging the work that came before it. That is the quiet cruelty of certain betrayals. They don't deny your effort. They erase its value. By the time Evan stood in that trust office, calmly questioning my stability, he wasn't inventing a new story. He was continuing an old one. My father, Thomas Donnelly, never believed in urgency. Rushing, he used to say, is how you miss the important part. He was an electrical inspector for most of his life, the kind who double-checked, even when everyone else was ready to sign off. He trusted systems, but only after he understood them. After my mother died, his world narrowed. He stopped hosting, stopped traveling. He kept his routines small and precise. Coffee at 6, paper at 7, a walk if the weather allowed. When his health began to fail, it did so unevenly. Some days he was sharp as ever, correcting my math when I balanced his checkbook. Other days, he lost words mid-sentence and laughed it off like it was nothing. "I'm just tired," he'd say. What he never did was pretend he didn't notice his limits. That's what set him apart. He asked me for help, not because I was his daughter, but because I paid attention. "Evan means well," he told me once, when I gently suggested my brother visit more often. "But he moves fast. You move carefully." He said it like praise. During the last year of his life, my father began organizing things more deliberately. He labeled folders, wrote notes to himself, simplified accounts. He never announced these actions. He just did them. One afternoon, as I sat with him at the dining table sorting paperwork, he paused and looked at me. "People will misunderstand this," he said quietly. "What?" I asked. "Me trusting you," he replied. "They'll think it's because you're here. They won't see that it's because you're capable," I wanted to argue. To say it didn't matter what people thought. He shook his head. "It will," he said, "just not right away." When he died, there was no dramatic moment of revelation, no last-minute confession, just files, notes, and systems he'd built to outlast confusion. He didn't leave me wealth. He left me clarity. And more importantly, he left me permission to wait, to let other people speak first, to let assumptions stretch until they broke under their own weight. To trust that careful truth, once complete, does not need defending. Sitting in that trust office weeks later, listening to my brother explain why I couldn't be trusted, I felt my father's presence more clearly than I had since the funeral, not urging me to speak, urging me to hold steady. The first letter came 3 weeks after the meeting at First Harbor Trust. It wasn't threatening. It didn't accuse me of anything directly. It was written in that neutral, professional tone, meant to sound reassuring, while quietly shifting the ground beneath your feet. It informed me that, due to family concerns, certain aspects of my father's trust administration would be reviewed. Temporary safeguards might be put in place. Access to some accounts could be limited until clarification was complete. In other words, my brother had turned conversation into procedure. Evan called me that night. "I didn't want it to get this formal," he said, sounding tired. "But you weren't responding. We needed transparency." I listened. I let him talk about responsibility, about protecting Dad's legacy, about how these things can look from the outside. When he finally paused, waiting for reassurance, I said only, "I understand." He exhaled, relieved. That was when I realized something important. He truly believed this was reasonable. Within days, the effects rippled outward. A scheduled transfer stalled without explanation. A bank representative who had known me for years suddenly asked for additional verification. My name, once associated with routine efficiency, was now attached to a question mark. Even at work, the shift was noticeable. My manager, Helen Brooks, asked if everything was okay at home. Compliance reviews, she explained gently, required employees to disclose potential conflicts. She emphasized that it was procedural, nothing personal. Procedure again. I went home each night to a quiet house and stacks of documents I suddenly wasn't sure how to handle. Not because I lacked confidence, but because every move now felt like it might be interpreted as something else. Interference. Resistance. Control. Sharon emailed once, suggesting mediation. Her tone was warm, almost friendly. "Let's not make this adversarial," she wrote. But it already was. I could feel the narrative tightening around me, shaping itself without my input. I was becoming the problem, simply by remaining present. And still, I didn't speak, because something about the timing didn't sit right. And timing, I'd learned, is rarely accidental. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being doubted quietly. No one confronts you. No one raises their voice. Instead, doors close a fraction of a second slower. Emails arrive with added recipients. Decisions are postponed until things are clearer. That was the week everything narrowed. At work, a project I've been leading was reassigned temporarily. Helen avoided my eyes when she told me. She said it was only until the review concluded. She said she trusted me. Trust, I learned, doesn't always protect you. At the bank, I was asked to bring identification I'd already provided. Then additional documentation. Then patience. I complied. At night, the house felt louder than usual. The refrigerator hummed. Pipes clicked. I replayed conversations in my head, wondering if silence had crossed into passivity. For the first time, I considered whether Evan might be right. Not about my intentions, but about appearances. Maybe I should have spoken sooner, pushed back harder, claimed authority out loud instead of assuming it would be understood. That doubt settled deep. One evening, after a particularly frustrating call with a trust administrator, I sat on the floor of my living room, surrounded by my father's files. Neatly labeled, carefully ordered. Everything exactly where it was supposed to be. And still, I felt unsteady. I found a note tucked inside a folder marked Utilities. My father's handwriting had grown uneven near the end, but the words were clear. If you're reading this, it means someone is asking questions. That's okay. Let them. I held the paper longer than necessary. This was the lowest point, not because I was losing, but because I was tired of waiting. Tired of being interpreted instead of heard. If you've ever been in that place where your integrity feels invisible and your silence is mistaken for weakness, I want you to know something. That feeling doesn't mean you're wrong. It means the pressure is working. Stay with me a little longer. If this part of the story feels familiar, you're not alone. You can leave a thought below if you want. Sometimes naming the doubt is the first step past it, because this is where things begin to shift. The detail I noticed wasn't dramatic enough to feel like a breakthrough. It was a number. I was reviewing my father's trust disbursements late one evening, not because anyone had asked me to, but because routine has always been how I calm my thoughts. I spread the statements across the dining table, aligned by date, then by category. Medical expenses, utilities, insurance premiums, everything matched. until it didn't. A recurring service payment caught my eye. Same vendor name, same description, but the amount shifted slightly over 3 months. Not much, just enough to be inconsistent. Most people would ignore it. I didn't. My father had been meticulous. When his memory faltered, his habits didn't. If a number changed, there was a reason, an adjustment, a note. This one had none. I checked the corresponding invoices. 2 matched. 1 didn't exist. I told myself not to overthink it. Errors happen. Systems mislabel things. But the timing bothered me. The discrepancy appeared shortly after Evan began asking pointed questions about my oversight. I traced the payment back through the Trust's administrative portal. The approval log showed a manual authorization. Not mine. The name attached wasn't Evan's. It was Sharon's. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, waiting for the tension in my chest to turn into something clearer. Fear, maybe. Anger. Instead, I felt steadier, because this wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. One small deviation in a system designed to avoid exactly that. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't email the trust office. I didn't call Evan. I opened a notebook and wrote down dates. And then I kept going. Once you stop assuming good faith, patterns appear. I reviewed every manual authorization Sharon had access to since my father's hospitalization. There weren't many, just enough to look benign. Reimbursements, adjustments, corrections. But when I mapped them against my father's condition, something emerged. Each manual action coincided with days he was most disoriented. Days I'd noted in my calendar with quiet concern. Days Evan hadn't visited. I pulled my father's personal planner from the file cabinet. He'd stopped writing full sentences near the end, but he still marked days he felt off. The dates aligned. This wasn't theft in the obvious sense. It was repositioning. Small decisions nudged just far enough to benefit one direction without triggering alarms. I understood then why Evan had pushed so hard for procedure. Procedure diffuses responsibility. I requested the Trust's internal audit history under the guise of clarification. The administrator complied without suspicion. They always do when requests sound reasonable. Buried in the audit notes was a comment flagged but never escalated. Unusual approval source. No follow-up requested. No follow-up. Because no one expected trouble from someone who smiled so easily. I closed the file and sat back, the room quiet around me. The truth hadn't been hidden by complexity. It had been buried under familiarity. Sharon's presence. Evan's confidence. My silence. Together, they made an assumption feel like fact. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not from anxiety, but from focus. I wasn't angry. I wasn't afraid. I was assembling something. Not a confrontation, a sequence. Because once you understand how something unfolded, you don't need to argue about it. You only need to show it in order. And for the first time since my brother spoke for me in that glass-walled room, I knew exactly where this was going. Not because I wanted to win, but because the truth, when followed patiently, tends to arrive whether anyone invites it or not. The document I needed wasn't hidden. That was the most unsettling part. It had been sitting exactly where it should have been. Filed correctly, scanned properly, and ignored, because no one expected it to matter. I found it in the Trust's digital archive under a routine heading, Supplemental Authorizations. The file name was generic, the date unremarkable. If I hadn't been looking for inconsistencies instead of explanations, I would have skipped past it like everyone else had. It was a single-page amendment submitted 6 months before my father died. Not a change of beneficiaries. Not a transfer of authority. Just a clarification of approval limits what could be authorized remotely, what required direct consent, and what could never be adjusted without the primary trustee present. My name was listed. So was Evan's. Sharon's was not. Yet the amendment included a handwritten note in the margin, scanned along with the page. Temporary exception approved due to family assistance needs. No initials, no signature, no justification. I compared the timestamp to the audit log. The note had been added 3 days before the first unauthorized manual adjustment. I printed the page and placed it beside my father's old planner, the one with uneven handwriting and careful circles around bad days. The alignment was precise in a way that felt almost impersonal. This wasn't carelessness. It was convenience. Someone had decided rules were flexible because they believed no one would question them. I contacted the trust administrator again, this time requesting clarification on the handwritten note. I kept my tone neutral, curious. 2 days later, I received a response. Not from the administrator, but from the compliance department. They asked for a meeting. That was when I understood the weight of what I was holding. Documents don't accuse. They don't speculate. They simply exist. And this one existed in a way that could no longer be smoothed over. I didn't tell Evan. I didn't confront Sharon. I waited. Because evidence doesn't gain strength by being rushed. It gains strength by being placed in the right hands at the right time without emotion attached. The call came from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, Mark Ellison, my father's longtime financial advisor. He had always been polite, but distant, deferential to Evan's confidence and Sharon's charm. During my father's illness, Mark had directed most communication toward them, assuming, like everyone else, that they were the decision-makers. Now, his voice sounded different, measured, careful, slightly strained. "I wanted to talk before the review concludes," he said. Off the record. We met in his office the following afternoon. He closed the door behind us and didn't sit down right away. "I should have asked more questions," he said finally. "That's on me." He explained that Sharon had contacted him directly several times during my father's decline. She'd framed her requests as efficiency, helpfulness, protection. "She said you were overwhelmed," Mark admitted. "That she was stepping in so you wouldn't have to." I didn't react. I believed her, he continued. It fit the narrative. Then he reached into a drawer and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were emails, voicemails transcribed, notes from calls he hadn't thought significant at the time, patterns, requests timed around trust adjustments, language that mirrored the unauthorized note almost exactly. Temporary, family need. No need to complicate this. Mark looked at me then, really looked. When compliance asked me to review the amendment, he said, I realized something was wrong. Not because of what was done, but because of how carefully you weren't included. That was the part that shifted him. Not greed, not malice, exclusion. "I won't testify against them," he said quietly. "But I will tell the truth, in writing, on record." That was enough. I thanked him and stood to leave. As I reached the door, he spoke again. "You never once tried to convince me," he said. "You let the work speak." I nodded. That's how my father taught me. Outside, the air felt lighter, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because the story no longer depended on my voice alone. The truth had found allies, not dramatic ones, not righteous ones, just people who had grown tired of carrying something that didn't belong to them. And that, I knew, was how this would end. Quietly, clearly, in order. The review meeting was scheduled for a Monday morning. Same building, same glass walls, same polished table that reflected faces a little too clearly. This time, there were more people in the room. A representative from compliance, a legal advisor from the trust. Mark Ellison sat near the end of the table, hands folded, eyes lowered. Evan arrived confident, but restless. Sharon smiled as if this were an inconvenience she expected to smooth over. I arrived on time and said very little. The compliance officer outlined the purpose of the meeting and began distributing documents. Pages slid across the table in neat stacks. Dates, logs, amendments. No commentary. Sharon's smile faded first. She flipped through the pages too quickly, then slowed. Evan leaned closer, his brow tightening as he read the same lines twice. The handwritten note, the one without initials, sat quietly in the center of the packet. The compliance officer spoke evenly. "This exception lacks authorization and contradicts the amendment filed 3 days prior. We'd like clarification." Sharon opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "It was informal," she said. "We were just trying to help." Mark spoke then, his voice steady but restrained. He described the calls, the phrasing, the timing. He did not accuse, he did not editorialize, he explained. The legal advisor nodded and asked Sharon a single question. Why was Miss Donnelly consistently excluded from these communications? Sharon looked at me for the first time that morning. I met her eyes. I said nothing. There was no dramatic confrontation, no raised voices, just a quiet recognition spreading across the room as the pieces aligned without effort. The compliance officer closed the folder. "Thank you," she said. "That will be sufficient." The determination followed shortly after. Authority reaffirmed, irregularities noted, corrective actions outlined. The room felt different as we stood to leave, lighter, but also stripped of illusion. Evan stopped me near the door. "I didn't know," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. I nodded once. Knowing had never been the issue. Life didn't rearrange itself overnight. It rarely does. The trust moved forward cleanly. The accounts stabilized. Procedure returned to what it was always meant to be: boring, predictable, fair. At work, my projects came back without comment. No apologies were offered, but something steadier replaced suspicion. I was consulted again, trusted again. That was enough. Evan called once more a few weeks later. His voice was subdued, uncertain. "I should have listened," he said. "I was here," I replied. We didn't speak again after that. I spent a Saturday morning going through my father's house one last time. I didn't rush. I opened drawers I'd avoided, threw out nothing I wasn't ready to part with. I kept his planner, the notes, the quiet evidence of a man who understood that clarity doesn't require volume. Sharon faded from my life entirely. No confrontation, no final words, just distance settling naturally where trust no longer fit. Mark sent a short message, wishing me well. He wrote that he'd updated his processes. That mattered to me more than an apology. I returned to my routines. Coffee in the morning, lists, order, attention. Not because I needed control, but because this is how I move through the world. People sometimes mistake patience for weakness, silence for submission, careful observation for indecision. They forget that some of the strongest people they'll ever meet are simply waiting until the truth finishes assembling itself. My father taught me that. You don't need to rush the facts. You don't need to argue with assumptions. You don't need to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You just need to stay steady long enough for the truth to arrive on its own. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been doubted quietly, sidelined politely, or underestimated because you didn't fight loudly, I'm glad you were here with me until the end. If you feel like it, leave a note or share this with someone who might need it right now. Another story is waiting, and sometimes the right one finds us exactly when we're ready to hear it.